Hello, and welcome to the seventh lecture in the Alcohol and Intoxicants course. Today we're going to be speaking about alcohol and Islam. And last time we were discussing in class the ambivalence of the early church toward alcohol. On the one hand, it was central to the religion, required in the Eucharist. It's actually what the blood of Jesus became in the miracle of the Mass, or at least what was decided later in the Middle Ages. But increasingly seen as a pleasure that could easily be overindulged and also dangerous, right? And wine, on the other hand, was considered nutritious, right, in Western medical theory, and therefore promotes the generation of blood within your body. And also, I think what these people were thinking of, primarily medically driven, was that the excess of nutrition in your body, in both men and women, becomes sperm. And an excess of that, what's called a plethora, leads to stimulation of the libido. So people were thinking that a very well-nourished body is also one that's apt to commit sin. And so for holy people, it was best to abstain, even though there's no place really in the Bible that says don't drink wine. Jesus drank it all the time, it seems, or at least he's around wine all the time. But for the early churchmen to remain celibate, not to have their sexual arousal stimulated, meant avoiding meat and also avoiding wine, the two most nutritious substances. And of course, during fasts, they took this very seriously. They didn't eat or drink anything. But of course, people otherwise drank and ate as much as they liked, despite this, and sometimes in excess. But what we'll see increasingly in the early church is that drunkenness was considered a deadly sin, and we discussed last time why that was the case. Partly because, remember, the early Christians were not the rulers, right? They were the ones being ruled and oppressed, and in a sense taking the values of Western civilization, things like beauty and strength and prowess in war, I should say Greco-Roman civilization, and turning those things into negatives, things that were sinful, pride and avarice and lust and all those other things. But remember that food and drink were the gateway sin. They were the ones that sort of opened the possibility of committing other sins. And we'll go much further into that when we get to the Middle Ages. But the attitude toward alcohol in the next major religion to arise, despite official prohibition, is actually also strangely ambivalent, or at least to start with. We know that in the ancient world, people enjoyed wine and beer, and these were certainly also available in the Arabian Peninsula, right, where Islam begins. It's actually much too hot and dry to grow grapes there, but they imported them from the north, right? Grapes grew in places like Syria, that's about 1,000 miles away, and certainly in the whole Fertile Crescent has lots of grapes. And in Arabic, actually, the word is khamr, Khamr. And when Islam arose in the Arabian Peninsula, people knew wine, right? They had various kinds of wine. The founder of this religion, or I should say the prophet technically, lived from, in our calendar, 570 to 642. The Islamic calendar begins on the Hijra, which is, so they're 500 years behind us. And to start, Muhammad actually definitely drank alcoholic beverages like everyone else, right? He was a sort of middle-class merchant family that would certainly have been familiar with wine. And there are even passages in the Quran, which is his words that were dictated, that praise wine. For example, Surah 16, verse 69 says, "We give you the fruit of the palm and the vine, from which you derive intoxicants and wholesome food." So implies that that's perfectly okay, right? Or I've also seen it translated as, "And from the fruit of the date palm and the vine ye get out wholesome drink and food. Behold, in this also is a sign for those who are wise." Now, I should mention there's technically no such thing as a translation of the Quran. It has to be in Arabic. These are interpretations, which of course every translation really is anyway. But I just want you to see that in the beginning there's not really any antipathy toward alcohol. So so the food part refers, of course, to dates and grapes. And we haven't really discussed this other kind of wine that's probably alluded to here, which is palm wine, which is a lot more typical in arid and tropical regions, especially in Africa. You also find it in India, southern India. So it's basically just the sap that comes from the flower of the palm. It's this milky white liquid that's tapped out of it. And it's not unlike grape juice in that it starts to ferment almost immediately. You don't have to do any processing to it at all. Once yeast attacks it, there's so much sugar in it that it converts into alcohol very easily. And as you let it go longer, it gets stronger. It also gets more sour. So it's a kind of a bacterial fermentation as well. But it is actually the simplest of all fermented drinks. Really nothing has to be done to it. Even mead, which is, you could argue, is just as simple as honey, but you have to add water to get that whole thing started. This is nothing. You just get it out of the tree, and it makes wine itself. So, in any case, there's nothing inherently bad about wine, but there's an idea that certainly when people drink too much, they tend to do bad things. And there are cautionary phrases all over the place. For example, they will ask you about wine and gambling. Answer, in both there is great sin, but also some things of use unto men. But their sinfulness is greater than their use. So in other words, wine actually and alcohol serve some purposes, but the dangers are perhaps greater than the benefits. And it seems to again imply that there's no prohibition per se, and wine could be useful, of course, like for health, as we've talked about. And I think that's what he has in mind here. The usefulness of wine is its medicinal use. And not yet at this point, but I should mention also something very important is that Islam actually adopts Greek medicine. It gets translated from Greek, sometimes into Aramaic or Syriac, and then into Arabic. But the foundation of Arabic science and medicine is actually Greek. And in fact, it dies out in the West when Rome falls, but it survives in the Middle Ages in the Islamic world. And that happens later on, but it's the whole humoral theory which we've been talking about, which of course puts wine at the center of as a very nutritious substance. Later on, when we talk about the greatness of Islamic civilization in the Middle Ages, it's Galenic medicine they're using, okay, with Avicenna and Averroes and people like that. So, in any case, back to Muhammad himself. Muhammad warns against certain cases when you might get drunk. For example, believers do not approach your prayers when you are drunk, but wait till you can grasp the meaning of the words. And what this seems to suggest is that drinking a little before prayer is actually fine if you don't lose your senses, as long as you're not completely befuddled. And you might even go far as to think the sentence implies that getting drunk is actually okay too, as long as you're not praying. Now, the question is that you have to, as a devout Muslim, you have to pray 5 times a day. So, at any given point, that's going to prevent you from getting very drunk, because you're going to have clear senses in order to pray. So that's, it's a warning of a kind. But I think what is most fascinating is we can see, remember, people were following Muhammad around, taking down his words, and at one point he actually changes his mind about this, and about alcohol. And the most often cited passage in the Quran says this. It's the 590. Believers, wine and games of chance, idols and divining arrows are abominations devised by Satan. Avoid them so you may prosper. Satan seeks to stir up enmity and hatred among you by means of wine and gambling, and to keep you from the remembrance of Allah and from your prayers. So again, now it's actually becoming a bad thing. So again, it's the wine itself that is now becoming an evil thing, and the fact that people, often while they're doing that, they gamble and argue and neglect their prayers and drink too much. And there was also a little incident in which, and I think I have this story correct, it's Muhammad was at a wedding, and everyone there was drinking wine, as they're wont to do. And I should mention also, while we're here, is that the ceremony itself would not have been that different from what was practiced by Jews and Christians. And there are Jews and Christians around in the Arabian Peninsula at this time. And there are a lot of features that Islam borrows from these two religions. For example, the pork prohibition is common between the two religions. And in Judaism, wine would be drunk by the bride and groom as a symbol of their deal, basically, and then the glass is broken. So it's partly they wrap it up and they step on it. So it's partly like making a pact or a vow. But I've also often heard rabbis actually explain that what's happening is this is a symbolically refers to the losing of the virginity after the wedding. But in any case, it's definitely a pact, and once the glass is broken, you can't go back on it. I think that's also part of what's happening. So, in any case, there's a wedding of a kind going on, and Muhammad is there, and everyone is toasting, right? Which you toast the health of the bride and groom, and you make a pact to watch after them, right, and be kind to them and whatever. So, and everything was actually going fine until someone gets insulted at this wedding. And remember, the other thing is there are no very strict rules of protocol here. Remember, unlike in Confucian society, here people sit around sit on the floor, usually on a rug, and they share their food, and no one eats first, and it's because it's round that no one has precedence in the way that you would say in a Roman banquet or in a Confucian food or drinking ceremony. So because there's no strict rules of protocol, people can be insulted, right? And if I remember correctly, what happens is someone gets in a fight and someone grabs a big bone and whaps someone else on the head with it, and a general ruckus breaks out. I don't think the details are so important, but Muhammad looks at all this and says, wow, I think alcohol is actually a bad thing. I think we have to ban it. And the sort of commentaries that come out based on the Quran, called the Hadith, explains this prohibition. In other words, all we know is the story, but not really the rationale behind why Muhammad decides to ban alcohol. So this is Sunan Ibn Majah, Volume 3, Book of Intoxicants, Chapter 30, Hadith number 3371. If you're interested in finding the original, it says very clearly, alcohol is the mother of all evils. It is the most shameful of evils. Number 3392 says, anything which intoxicates in a large quantity is prohibited, even in a small quantity. So now it's going back on everything we've heard in the earlier part. So this is the commentary on the Quran, right? So number 3380, it was reported by Anas, may Allah be pleased with him, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, said, God's curse falls on 10 groups of people who deal with alcohol. The one who distills it, we'll come back to what's actually going on there, the one for whom it has been distilled, the one who drinks it, the one who transports it, the one to whom it's been brought, the one who serves it, the one who sells it, the one who uses money from it, the one who buys it, and the one who buys it for someone else. So if you get someone who's over 21 to go to the liquor store and buy it for you, that's also a sin. So all these people, anyone who profits in any way from it is cursed by this hadith. And of course, this is really these few passages are the basis for what is a legal ban in many Muslim countries. Saudi Arabia, Iran, they are technically, alcohol is banned. If you're a foreigner, somehow some people get it here or there, but there's no liquor store, there's no bar, there's no any public place you can find this. Now you're probably wondering, as I say this, well, why then do some Muslim countries allow alcohol? The more secular states like Turkey, there are there and in Lebanon they make some very good wine. In fact, Turkey is of course one of the homeland of wine. And they also make a distilled spirit, arak or rakı, which is Turkish kind of aniseed flavored alcohol that you add a little water to and it becomes milky white. It's like Greek ouzo. Okay? And really what it depends on is whether the state takes the religion as the basis for its legal system or whether it's secularized, like some Islamic states, and obviously which sect they belong to. And these divisions happened a long, long time ago. They happened partly because some sects wanted their leaders to have descended directly from Muhammad's family, and wanted the society to be ruled by clerics. Other states don't. Others become quite modern, in fact, and it really has also how one interprets the word khamr. Is it only grape wine that's being banned, but not other beverages? Is there, there's also another kind of wine made from dates called nabid, which some commentators said was perfectly okay and it was never banned. Others specify that any alcoholic beverage made from grapes or honey or palm or grain, anything that's alcoholic, is forbidden. But the fact is that in the ancient world, as today, many people who are Muslims still drank it, and it spreads, in fact, with Islam. Surprisingly, even though there's an official ban, some sects, some people drink it anyway, and they even manufacture it. So let me talk about how that happened. What really became of the Islam after Muhammad's death? This religion spread very quickly, much more quickly than Christianity and Judaism, certainly. It spread throughout the Middle East, in many cases among places that were Christians underneath the Byzantine Empire. Remember, the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the successor. When the West fell, the eastern half stayed viable and ruled over Egypt, the Holy Land, Turkey, Syria, much of the Middle East. Okay, and these places, I should mention, were Hellenized. In other words, they spoke Greek. That was the language of trade within the Byzantine Empire. They, wore toga, watched theaters, everything. And in fact, the Hellenic world spread all the way to India. Remember the conquests of Alexander the Great? Well, there's still Greek-ish kind of culture throughout the Middle East. But in fact, the subjects to the Byzantine Empire were not very happy about it, right? They didn't, when the Islamic armies showed up, many of them willingly converted and said, we're done with the Byzantine Empire. We will happily embrace Islam. So Islam spread very, very quickly in to the west and to the east. And in 711, they get as far as Spain in one direction, and they head all the way to India in the other. So what was really kind of part of the whole Greco-Roman world, I think this is the way to really think about it, converted to Islam. Now, some under force, some willingly, many people willingly converted. And I should mention also that there are Christian and Jewish communities within that Muslim world. Allowed to practice, in fact, who learned Arabic as their language and paid taxes, but otherwise lived relatively peacefully. We tend to think that the long-standing animosity between Jews and Muslims goes back to ancient times. It most certainly does not. Okay, it is a very modern thing, dating to after World War II, when the State of Israel was set up. But before then, Jews lived within Muslim countries very, I don't know whether very happily, but they lived there peacefully. Let's shift just slightly geographically, because the center of Muslim civilization ends up not being Saudi Arabia. I mean, Mecca and Medina are still important cities, but the center, the economic center, the intellectual center, the cultural center is Baghdad. Okay, and that is partly because the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliphate, moves there after the Syrian Umayyad Caliphate, and so the political center of the Muslim world moves to Baghdad, which was a new city, very, very new and modern, and it was the inheritor of this remarkable wealth of culture that came from Greece. Okay, and we're talking the science, the philosophy, the medicine, the literature, everything that was translated from Greek into Arabic. So Islamic culture changes dramatically after about the year 800 and 900s. And if you want to get a sense of where are we talking about, what is this culture? What are the signal characteristics? Well, just imagine in your mind Aladdin. flying carpets, genies in lamps, harems bedecked in silk, 1,001 nights, perfumes, spices imported from the east, and an extraordinarily complex cuisine. Um, and wine. They make it right there. Okay, so the wine culture does not disappear when Islam comes. Of course, devout people don't drink it, um, but it's certainly a part of the economy there. So it's not that simply that the prohibition was ignored or that the rulers kind of turned a blind eye or something. In one respect, they're building on a tradition that is within Orthodox Islam. And let me explain this for a moment. You know, Islam um, had an explicit depiction of the pleasures awaiting the good in the afterlife. Um, the idea of the after you die, if you're good, you will sit on soft cushions. There's beautiful music. There's gurgling fountains, beautiful tiled courtyards, and incense, and all of your senses will be stimulated. There are even beautiful young virgins, the houris, to use as you please. So there are sweets. Sugar is the brand new hot thing in the world. And of course, there is wine. So people in the afterlife do enjoy wine. And it seems that aesthetically, if we look at the arts of this period in Baghdad, they are striving to replicate what will be in paradise, right? If it's not wrong after in the afterlife as rewards, why would it be wrong here? I think that's the logic, is that these things are inherently good. They should be enjoyed here on earth. So the Abbasid palace, or is essentially an approximation of paradise, and it includes wine. Okay, it's part of it. And of course, you know, to go with all this, you also need poetry, which extols the pleasures of wine. And I should mention also, there is a pre-Islamic tradition which celebrates wine. Okay, that's nothing. That's not an invention of this period, but it seems to have been a flourishing genre by the time we get to this. To Baghdad, so it's a whole genre of wine poetry called kamriya, and the most common metaphor is to compare the one's lover's saliva to wine. Okay, so when you kiss them, you taste wine, and in fact, Muhammad's own conquest of Mecca was celebrated in a poem shortly after his death, written by his companion. This is Hassan ibn Thabit. That says, Ka'ana kabi atan mi baiti rasin yakunu mizajuha. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing all this, but I love the way it sounds. Anyway, it says her saliva is like the drink of Beyraz. That's a place in Jordan in which honey and water are mixed. Or like the apple that is given full time by the picker to ripen. When the drinks are mentioned, then all the drinks of the world must be sacrificed for the wine. When we utter an uncalled for speech during war or altercation, we blame the wine for the same, and when we drink it excessively, it makes us kings and grants us the courage of lions, and consequently we do not avoid facing the enemy. So apparently this guy stopped drinking wine once he became a devout Muslim, but he still wrote about it in this tradition, which is interestingly, and oddly, there's this large corpus of wine poetry written by Muslims, and you wonder, how do they do that? I guess it's there's certainly other. I mean, the people who make wine could have been Christian or Muslim or Jewish, for that matter, but drinking it, obviously, it's it seems strange, right, that there's this flourishing genre praising wine within Islam. So there's another poet, Abu Nuwas, at the time of in Baghdad, at the time of Harun al-Rashid. This is sort of the height of the civilization. 756 to 814 is when he ruled. And Abu Nuwas was kind of the bad boy of the time, writing about taboo subjects. So he wrote about sex, he wrote about alcohol, all sorts of things like that. So let me read you a little bit. Up, maiden, fetch the morning drink, and spare not the wine of Andarin, clear wine that takes a saffron hue when water is mixed warm therein. The lover tasting it forgets his passion, his heart is eased of pain. The stingy miser, as he lifts the goblet, regardeth not his gain. Pass round from left to right, why lettest thou, maiden, me and my comrades thirst? So, he's drinking, in company. Here's another one. Suad is gone, and today my heart is lovesick, enthralled to her, unrequited, bound in chains. And Suad, when she came forth from the morning of departure, but was a gazelle with bright black downcast eyes. When she smiles, she lays bare a shining row of side teeth that seem to have been bathed once and twice in fragrant wine. Wine mixed with pure cold water from the pebbly hollow where the north wind blows, a bend of the valley from which the wind drives away every speck of dust, and it brims over with white foam torrents fed by showers gushing from a cloud of morn. Now, this is lovely, sort of evocative poetry, but imagine he's talking about her teeth, and it seems like she's been drinking wine. It's because they're washed with it, not stained with red wine, I assume. So, four things banish grief and care. Four things incline body and soul and eye to enjoy if they be there, water, wine, gardens bright, and faces fair. I think that's just lovely, sweet, and let me read a little bit more. This is great. This is comes from translations of Eastern poetry and prose translated by C.F. Clay. Ho a cup and fill it up, and tell me it is wine, for never will I drink in shade if I can drink in shine. Cursed and poor is every hour that sober I must go, but rich I am whene'er well drunk I stagger to and fro. Speak for shame the loved one's name, let vain disguises fall, good for naught and pleasures hid behind a curtain wall. So this is, it's very English kind of meter there, which I guess the translator is the one who did that. But they're nice. Let me give you one more. So this is number 34. Come, Suleiman, sing to me, and the wine quick bring to me. Lo, already dawn is here in golden mantle clear. Whilst the flask goes twinkling round, pour me a cup that leaves me drowned, with oblivion ne'er so nigh. Let the shrill muezzin cry. And the muezzin is the priest that goes up onto the tower and calls you to prayer, which is actually kind of weirdly haunting and pleasant. It's I was in Turkey not that long ago, and you hear over loudspeakers throughout the city the call of the muezzin to prayer. It's kind of amazing. So it's in this context that I want to bring up a person who is, without any doubt, the greatest of all writers about wine throughout history. There's no one even comes close. And this is a poet whose name is Omar Khayyam. You may have heard of him. His dates are 1038 to 1131. He was an actual person. A Persian philosopher, mathematician. He wrote texts on algebra. That's an Arabic word, of course, algebra. He was an astronomer, and he was from Nishapur, but went to Bukhara. So this is way, way, way out in the east, in what's now, I guess, Uzbekistan. It's very far out there. It's on the Silk Road, right? So he would have seen all these goods going back and forth, and he was there at the same time that the Chinese had trade contacts with the Abbasids in Baghdad. So there's a real connection. That's the and wine was, of course, one of those things that went across, right? This is when the Chinese get grape wine and horses and start playing polo, all sorts of interesting things like that. So arguably, the poem that he wrote, called the forgetting what it is, is has an odd place in the history of literature. It's called the Rubaiyat. Sorry about that. And because it wasn't actually very well known in Persia, but it was translated in the 19th century into English by a guy named Edward Fitzgerald, who was this a very loose translation. I think you might even call it an adaptation, but it appealed to this sort of decadent fin de siècle taste, and the sort of fashion for Orientalism, for Oriental carpets and paintings showing scenes of Cairo and Baghdad and things like that. If you think of Jean-Léon Gérôme, and there are a whole slew of paintings right here in the museum in the Hagen in Stockton. So there's and there's actually a classic book on this whole movement called Orientalism by Edward Said. Really, really fascinating book. The whole idea is that this was a romanticizing of the Middle East as a pretext to colonizing it, right? Taking it and ruling it and pretending they were doing something good for it. So, and that's true, okay? But in any case, the Victorian era read Omar as a beautiful poem to drunkenness, right? This is the era of I don't know, Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw, and they thought that's all it really meant. And in fact, the most famous quatrain in it. This a quatrain is 4 lines, so that's in fact what the word Rubaiyat means. Quatrains, and you probably know this: a book of verses beneath a bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou. Beside me singing in the wilderness, O wilderness, where paradise enow, meaning enough. Terrible rhymed attempt there, but and admittedly, even in this translation, there's this kind of weird pessimistic fatalism. Let me give you another one. There's a different translation. Make the most of what ye may spend before we to in dust descend, dust into dust, under dust to lie, sans wine, sans song, sans singer, sans end. And I think you should, what also made this book really popular is there are these extraordinary images by Edmund Sullivan, the illustrations, which we'll take a look at some of those in class. They're remarkable. Just if you're watching this, just Google Omar Khayyam and images, and you'll find the Fitzgerald edition from the 19th century with these stunning skeletons dancing and naked women and wine. It's really lovely. So commentators since that time have criticized Fitzgerald's translation, saying that he's basically missing the whole point. The poem is actually not about wine. It's about mystical union with God, ecstatic religious experience. And people have argued that Omar was a Sufi, which is a sect of Islam that tends to the mystical. So, and this was a kind of rapture where wine is a metaphor for the love of God, and getting drunk, losing one's senses, becoming enthralled, becoming entirely consumed. They argue that it's really a mystical religious text. There for all the translations I've seen of it, I'm yet to be convinced about this. But there's a but there are other really good translations, and let me just share with you a moment, because it's actually one of my favorite poems. And there's a translation by Robert Graves and Omar Ali Shah. And there's a huge controversy over whether this was plagiarized or what happened to it, but it was translated in 1967. And it was supposed to have been based on this newly found manuscript that they found in Afghanistan. It actually wasn't. They faked that. But I like this translation, so we'll read some of it in class and talk about what it really means, and whether it's just this ecstatic, wonderful ode to drunkenness, or whether it's something else. Okay, but let's move on for this lecture to the topic of distillation, because here we begin to get into some very interesting material. The earliest accounts of distillation, and I should mention there are several histories of this technology. There are what people claim to have been a kind of distilling apparatus in ancient times. There's a book by C. Ann Wilson called The Water of Life that even argues that it was part of the Dionysiac rites, but of course they didn't record it because it was a secret mystical cult, right? Well, if they didn't record it, how do you know it was there? That's my question. They refer to fire in wine in these mystical texts, and who knows what that actually means. It's probably some kind of metaphor. The fact is that the words that are used there really don't explain anything. They don't, there's no exact description of the technical process. But on the other hand, if you wanted to do a little experiment, this is a distinct possibility in ancient times that they were doing this. Take a pot of wine, heat it very gently, and put a dish towel over the top. Okay, clean one. And the steam, when the alcohol will rise up and get soaked into the dish towel, wring that out, and what you have is alcohol. That's all there really is to it. It's just a heating process. Once it's heated to 100 degrees Celsius, below 100 degrees Celsius, the alcohol will burn off before the water creates steam. So you're basically separating the alcohol. Doing this, it tastes like dirty dishwater, but still it's alcohol, so distilled alcohol. So the simplest still is really just a little flask. It's a retort flask, basically. So basically all you have is a little round pot with a domed lid and a tube sticking out of the whole thing. And what happens is, the thing is heated, usually put into like hot sand with a fire underneath, so the vessel doesn't break, and then the alcohol, before it reaches 100 degrees Celsius, goes up this long neck. Sometimes it goes down this way, and then the alcohol recondenses as it cools and drips into a cup. So it's really a very, very simple chemical procedure. And there is no doubt that there are vessels in ancient times that people were using to distill something, okay, to play with something. There's no evidence that anyone tried to use wine to distill that. And in fact, the word destillatio, to distill, comes from Latin. It means just to drip, but it has no particular reference to alcohol at all. There are other things you can distill. Water, in fact. And it's clear that even when the technology is there, what they are making usually in these early texts are things like rose water and perfumes and things like that. And the evidence of someone experimenting with alcohol, it's there probably around the 1st century AD in Alexandria. There's a kind of retort and what's called a cucurbit, which means a squash, right? Or not a squash, a gourd-shaped vessel, which is described by this guy named Zosimus. Do you remember him from way several lectures ago? He lays down the basic procedure for creating and recollecting steam. Now, if he actually made it, we don't know for sure. He describes these vessels, but not really what they're used for. It's definitely not something people drank. whether he did it or not, it had no impact on people's, drinking habits. So to say, okay, maybe this guy was doing it in his laboratory and so on. But this technology with Greek science did pass on to the Muslim world precisely when all those ancient Greek medical and mathematical and texts and optics and things were being translated from Greek to Arabic. And it's, again, important to point out that Greek science died out completely in the West, in Europe, after the fall of Rome. So in a sense, the court of Baghdad rescues all this literature, right? They're the ones who are keeping it. And in many fields, the Muslim scientists actually even surpass the ancients. Definitely true of mathematics. Think of why we use the word algebra, why we use the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, right? not Roman numerals, which would be dreadful for math, right? And in some fields, they actually surpass the ancients. Optics definitely is a Muslim invention. So, but for our purposes, the most important field is, of course, chemistry, right? We get the word from alchemia, or alchemy is the Latin word from it. There is a difference between these two, okay? They're not just synonyms. Alchemy is not a science per se, right? There's no experimental method, there's no scientific procedure, hypotheses, testing them with experiments or anything like that. It is very experimental though, and they do play around with a lot of stuff, but the purpose is slightly different. You may have heard alchemy is essentially a way to transmute base metals into gold, turn lead into gold, which always actually seemed very sensible to me. If you look at it, look at the number of protons and electrons. Lead and gold are actually kind of close. If you could knock out one of those protons, you could make gold. So I never understood why that seems so crazy. But in any case, that's a stereotype. That's not what alchemists are doing primarily. What they are doing primarily is trying to control the forces of nature. And it is a branch of mysticism, okay? It's not science in the way we think of it. Alchemy was essentially trying to replicate natural processes that you'd find in the world in a kind of laboratory, and then control those forces. So, for example, taking a drug and extracting its essence, or its active particle, its quintessence, the fifth essence. Remember the 4 elements, and this is the 5th one. So, and they're designed really to reduce compounds to their simplest and most powerful elemental constituents, what is often called sublimation, to change something so you get the active superpower ingredient out of it. It definitely lays the groundwork for chemistry later, okay? Don't get me wrong, much of the equipment comes directly from here, but it's not really it's not driven for the kind of practical results we would expect from chemistry, right? Partly to make medicines, yeah, that's there, but also, today we use chemicals to clean, to build, to construct things. I mean, we use it in science. That's not necessarily what they're doing there. So, as you can imagine, the word alcohol, okay, that's an Arabic word, the kol. Its origins are probably medicinal. That's probably what they were trying to do first. Following authors like Galen, you figure if wine is a really nourishing substance, it requires it needs to be broken down in your body, right? It goes through the process of digestion. It changes in your liver. It's transformed into your blood, and then it goes through your body and goes, and the vapors, the spirits, go up into your brain and distill there. In a sense, it's really kind of interesting that their bodily processes are replicated in the process of distilling. But the idea is your body takes a lot of energy to break that wine down and to make it into the spirits which nourish your brain. So why not try and replicate what your body is doing in a still? Right? Why not do the same thing? Why not break it down for it? And so this process of distilling wine, what you get at the end is called spirits. We still call it that, right? Spirits and any distilled alcohol comes directly from the medical idea of the blood being refined, super refined, and being a kind of gas that floats through your head. And if you can do it in a still and get a spirit, it will be assimilated and nourish directly without the process of your body going through all the energy of digesting. So the term in Latin, when it comes there in the Middle Ages, is called aqua vita, the water of life. Okay, aquavit, ushkabach. I mean, there's all these words. Whiskey come from the word water of life. Vodka means also little water. Okay, so it's not meant to be poetic or anything. This is literally the water of life we're talking about. Now let me explain just a little further what is meant by spirits. So again, this is the medical theory, goes back to Galen ultimately, but then these Muslim physicians expand on it and refine these theories. Especially Avicenna is one, Rhazes, Isaac Judea. So what they're let me try and explain what they're talking about here. What happens in the body is the food and drink goes into your stomach. It is converted by heat. Okay? It's just like a pot heating up something, and the heat changes this, breaks it down into something called chyme. Okay? This flows through your body to various organs, and then it goes through another refining process. Your liver changes it into blood, your spleen changes it into bile, your gallbladder into black bile. And then, of course, the blood goes throughout your whole body, and it assimilates. It becomes part of our body, okay, part of you, replenishing those parts that you lose in daily activity. Some of it is also rerouted to the heart, and then it passes through the lungs. Okay, they didn't know exactly how the blood circulates yet, but but in a sense, what they're thinking is that the blood is changed as it passes through the lungs. It becomes vitalized. It becomes imbued with this, what the Greeks called pneuma, like the word pneumatic, right? The kind of air we know, of course, the blood is being oxygenated, but they had a strange sense that something was changing there, and that some of this newly revitalized blood goes up into your brain, and the brain, because it's a cold and moist organ, it hits there and it goes pss, and it steams and cools off, and that kind of steam that comes off is the spirits. Okay? And when physicians talk about spirits, they are this thing that flows around the brain exactly the way we think of spirits in a glass. They're the essence of blood. So if in a sense, what you want to think about is that the body is a kind of still. Okay? You're distilling the food to make this essence of the wine or whatever to be the spirits which nourish your brain, and so in a sense, if you eat something bad, it'll make bad spirits, it'll give you bad dreams, it'll ruin your thoughts, ruin your mood, and everything. So again, alcohol is being the analogy of this spirits in the brain, directly nourishes. It can be used as a longevity medicine. Okay, this is something that because the digestion takes a lot of energy, this actually nourishes you directly. And for old people, it is it's great medicine. So I should mention this is true of most drugs that become recreational. They start out as medicinal. They have a kind of pharmaceutical use, let's say, and then as time goes on, people say this is really very good. Let's use this all the time and not have to get a prescription. So the let's talk a little bit about these people who experimented with alcohol. Jabir ibn Khayyam, or known as Geber in the Latin, 721 to 815, is the earliest and the most important of medieval Muslim alchemists who we know experimented with alcohol. It's usually to him that the invention of the alembic is credited, and alembic is a kind of round copper pot still. And copper is actually essential for the process, strangely enough. There are actually early ones made of clay, and these you can set in a bed of sand. They have a dome top on it and a long tube which directs the steam, and sometimes usually there's a coil, so there'll be a copper coil which allows the steam to cool and recondense. Nowadays an alembic you put that in a little pot of water, and that will immediately cool it down. And the reason that this whole contraption works is alcohol vaporizes at 78.37 degrees. That's 173.1 Fahrenheit, whereas 78 Celsius. But water vaporizes at 100 degrees Celsius, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So the water stays in the pot, and the alcohol comes up through, and as long as you can recondense it in the coil, then you've got alcohol. That's what comes out. So it's not entirely clear, and we'll look at pictures of stills, and I'll probably bring one into class eventually. So it's not entirely clear what Geber did in his experiments, though. Much as we saw in the Chinese sources, they may have been doing it, but we don't know for sure. And so, as you can imagine, there's a great deal of contention over who was the first to actually distill wine into alcohol. Now, the earliest incontrovertible example that includes a full recipe actually comes from southern Italy, Salerno, and the medical school there. And if you read one of the classics on the history of distillation by R.J. Forbes, which was written a long time ago, written in the 40s, he insists that medieval Muslims did not have distilled alcohol. He says, I'll quote you, no proof was ever found that the Arabs knew alcohol or any mineral acid in a period before they were discovered in Italy. Now, I think there's a lot more evidence now which suggests that they did. Al-Razi, this is called Razes, 865 to 925, is probably among the best candidates for the person who discovers this. He was a physician in Baghdad, and he has a fairly complete description of several different kinds of alembics, actually, all their various parts and how they work. And the Razi gives us an example of the human. He's the one who compared humans to still. Okay, that's, I didn't make that up. He did. Another early candidate is Abu al-Qasim Ha'alad ibn Abbas al-Zarawi, and his name in Latin comes down as Abul Qasis. Okay, if you ever see his name, it's rarely that whole long thing. And he says this: in this way, wine can be distilled by anyone who wants it distilled. And that seems like that's pretty evidence that he's doing it and he knows how to do it. He tried it, and obviously saying anyone can do this is no big deal. So we'll certainly come back to the earliest descriptions, which are in European, actually. How they got there, most likely they came from the Middle East. The word alembic goes right into Latin. The word alcohol. So there's little argument. There's little reason to argue all of this. There certainly is an earlier medieval Muslim roots, even if there's no actual recipe saying here's how it's done. But let me talk a little bit also about drinking customs in the Muslim world, because some countries, such as Egypt, Turkey, they do have an extensive history and a lot of tradition about how alcohol should be consumed. And one of these is called a meyhane. It's a wine house. It's a Persian word, and of course these existed in Persia before the revolution in Iran, and since that time alcohol's been banned. So this is earlier than that. But you also find these things in Turkey. You find them through the Balkans, which was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire. So although there may be a lot of drinks. The one that is most common is raki or rakı in Turkish. It's always accompanied by medze, which is little olives, feta, melon, eggplant, cucumbers and yogurt, beans, all these like little plates of dainties. I don't know what else to call them. They're not very, not very exotic or anything. They're pretty simple food, but salty little yummy nibblies to go along with this. And the place itself, the wine house, is sort of like a tavern. Okay, these certainly go back to classical times in many respects. But the interesting thing is that you don't order anything for yourself. You order things for the whole table. Everything is shared by everyone in common, and of course they eat with their hands. There's always music playing. After the 16th century, there's also tobacco, so people are smoking also, often with a long kind of hookah-like thing. And traditionally, it's also only men go to these houses. In fact, my great-grandfather played the oud in a place like this in Smyrna. He was a professional musician. He's a long kind of thin guitar, which he that's what he did for a living. So these sort of taverns are places people will go to gamble, play backgammon, play cards, cast dice, whatever it may be. But drinking is always a part of it. And I think it's very interesting that the kind of classical tradition that we saw in the ancient world, very much like the medicine and the science and the math and all those other things, is carried around in the drinking customs also. That it's a male thing in a private in a room that's not private, sorry, a public house, but goes along with little tasty nibblies and drinking, and of course the distilled raki replaces the wine that we saw in the ancient times. So next time we'll move on, and eventually, of course, we'll come back to distillation and how the water of life was so important for alchemists in the Middle Ages. Okay, see you next time.